The emergency meeting was called before dawn, without briefing papers and without warning, because what Prince William had uncovered could not wait for daylight. When he finally spoke inside that sealed room, the words landed with such force that even seasoned aides froze. What followed was not argument or denial, but a moment of visible collapse that exposed a betrayal the palace had spent years pretending did not exist. The emergency meeting. The summons went out before dawn, delivered through channels reserved for moments the palace prefers never to name. There was no agenda, no explanatory note, and no suggestion of discussion. Attendance was required, immediately and without delegation. Those who received it understood that this was not a routine coordination session or a precautionary briefing. Something had already crossed a line, and the meeting existed only because delay was no longer possible. By the time the first lights came on in the inner wing, the atmosphere had already shifted. Corridors that usually carried the quiet rhythm of early preparation felt compressed, as though sound itself had been instructed to travel cautiously. Palace staff moved with purpose but avoided eye contact, aware that questions would not be answered and speculation would only deepen unease. This was not secrecy as theater, it was secrecy as containment. The meeting room chosen was small by palace standards, intentionally so. Curtains were drawn despite the morning light. No refreshments were laid out. No aides were stationed along the walls. The doors were closed firmly enough to make clear that privacy was not a courtesy, but a condition. Those present were there because the institution had decided that the truth, whatever it was, could no longer be deferred. Prince William arrived early, carrying nothing in his hands and nothing in his expression that suggested what he intended to reveal. His composure was deliberate, not calm in the traditional sense, but controlled with effort. Those who noticed him understood that he was not there to listen, he was there to speak. King Charles followed shortly after, his presence quieter than usual, his posture betraying the fatigue of a night interrupted by information that does not allow for rest. He did not ask questions upon entering the room. He did not greet anyone beyond a brief nod. His silence carried expectation rather than uncertainty. Queen Camilla arrived last. Her demeanor was composed, her appearance consistent with routine obligation, yet those attuned to palace nuance noted a tension that had not been there before. She had not been told the purpose of the meeting, only that it was urgent and that her presence was required. That omission alone was unsettling. Also present was Princess Anne, whose inclusion signaled seriousness beyond optics. Anne was not summoned for mediation or reassurance. She was summoned when clarity was required, and sentiment could not be allowed to interfere. Her expression was neutral, but her attention was acute. Notably absent were communications advisors, legal counsel, and senior staff who normally populate emergency gatherings. Their exclusion was intentional. This was not a meeting about messaging or exposure. It was about internal reckoning, and the fewer witnesses, the less room for interpretation later. For several moments after everyone took their seats, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, not awkward, charged with the understanding that whatever was about to be said would not be undone. In palace culture, silence often precedes compromise. This silence preceded confrontation. William was the one who broke it. He did not begin with accusation or framing. He began with context, measured and precise, outlining why the meeting had been called at such an hour and why it could not wait. His tone was steady, but there was no softness in it. This was not a plea for attention, it was a declaration of necessity. He explained that information had come into his possession that could not be dismissed as rumor, misinterpretation, or internal disagreement. It had been corroborated independently and structured in a way that left little room for ambiguity. The institution, he said, had been operating under assumptions that no longer held. Camilla listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her expression attentive. At this stage, nothing had been directed at her personally. Yet the room felt oriented toward her, as though gravity itself had shifted slightly in her direction. Anne noticed it. Charles noticed it. Camilla noticed it too. William continued, emphasizing that the material he had reviewed was not about optics or external perception. It concerned internal conduct, institutional boundaries, and actions that had occurred out of sequence and without record. He was careful with his language, avoiding emotionally charged terms, but the implication was unmistakable. This was not about misunderstanding, it was about a breach. Charles finally spoke, asking a single question that cut through the tension. He wanted to know whether the information was recent or historical. William answered honestly. It spanned time. Anne shifted slightly in her chair, her attention sharpening. Normalization within an institution is always more dangerous than a singular event. It suggests complicity through habit rather than intent. Her gaze moved briefly to Camilla, not accusatory but assessing. Camilla's composure held, but the room sensed the narrowing of possibility. Emergency meetings do not convene to discuss abstractions. They convene because something has reached a point where silence becomes liability. Whatever William had brought could no longer be contained through informal correction. William made it clear that he had not convened the meeting to debate whether action was necessary. That determination had already been made. The purpose of the gathering was to ensure that what followed would be understood internally before it became visible externally. This was not negotiation, as the weight of that distinction settled heavily. Charles absorbed the statement without visible reaction, but those who knew him recognized the shift. This was not the son seeking approval. This was the heir asserting responsibility. The implications for family hierarchy were immediate and profound. Camilla finally spoke, asking what precisely had been brought forward and why it required this forum. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of urgency beneath it. William met her gaze without hesitation. He told her that the evidence would be presented in full, but only after the room understood the seriousness of what it contained. Anne intervened then, her voice calm but firm, stating that if the evidence met the threshold implied, the institution would need to prioritize clarity over comfort. No one disagreed. Disagreement would have suggested denial, and denial was no longer plausible. The evidence Prince William placed on the table. Prince William did not open the folder immediately. He left it closed on the table for several seconds, long enough for its presence to be felt before its contents were known. In that pause, the room adjusted to the reality that whatever lay inside had already altered the course of the meeting. This was not evidence offered for discussion. It was evidence introduced for acknowledgement. When he finally spoke again, his voice was measured and precise, stripped of ornament or accusation. He explained that what he was about to present had been assembled over time, verified independently, and structured to withstand scrutiny rather than emotion. It had not been sourced from rumor, inference, or internal rivalry. It existed because systems had recorded what individuals assumed would never be connected. He opened the folder and began laying out its contents methodically, one section at a time, careful not to overwhelm the room with volume. The documents were arranged chronologically, each segment building upon the last. Correspondence appeared alongside schedules, private notes alongside official outcomes. The effect was cumulative rather than dramatic, which made it so difficult to refute. The evidence did not allege intent. It demonstrated impact. At its core, the material traced a pattern of intervention that bypassed formal authority while shaping institutional decisions. It showed how access had been used to influence outcomes without documentation, how conversations had replaced records, and how familiarity had overridden oversight. None of this was presented as malicious. That distinction mattered. Malice could be denied, pattern could not. Queen Camilla remained silent as William spoke, her attention fixed on the pages now visible to everyone in the room. At first, her expression suggested focus rather than alarm. This was not unfamiliar terrain. Informal influence had always existed within the palace. What was different here was scale and accumulation. William highlighted several instances where advisory input had crossed into operational direction without record. He showed how meetings had been reframed after private conversations, how decisions had shifted following unminuted exchanges, and how staff had adjusted behavior instinctively in response to proximity rather than instruction. Each instance alone might have been dismissed as a coincidence. Together, they formed a map. The room absorbed this quietly. No one interrupted. Even Charles, who might once have asked for clarification, remained still, recognizing that questions would not alter what the documents already showed. This was not about interpretation, it was about acknowledgement. Princess Anne leaned forward slightly, scanning the alignment between dates and outcomes. She understood immediately why this evidence had been brought here, rather than filtered through advisory channels. It did not accuse. It exposed a structural vulnerability that the palace had ignored because it was comfortable. William continued, emphasizing that the evidence did not question loyalty or intention, it questioned boundaries. It showed that informal authority had been allowed to function as a substitute for process, creating blind spots that compromised accountability. The palace, he said, had been operating on trust without verification. That sentence landed heavily. Camilla shifted then, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the implications were becoming unavoidable. She did not deny the interactions described. She did not challenge the authenticity of the documents. Her concern, when she finally spoke, centered on interpretation. She suggested that influence had been exercised in good faith, in service of stability, and with the understanding that proximity carried responsibility. William listened without interruption. When she finished, he acknowledged her point, but returned to the evidence. Good faith, he said, did not negate consequence. Responsibility without a record creates risk, regardless of intent. The institution could not function on assurances alone. The evidence moved next into areas that raised more profound concern. William showed how informal intervention had intersected with sensitive matters that required strict separation of influence. In these cases, the absence of documentation did not merely obscure the process, it undermined safeguards designed to protect the monarchy from internal distortion. Charles spoke then, asking whether any of these actions had violated explicit rules. William answered carefully. The rules, he said, had not been violated because they had not been enforced. The problem was not defiance, it was erosion. That distinction reframed the entire conversation. Anne added that erosion was often more dangerous than rebellion because it went unnoticed until repair became difficult. Her observation was not directed at Camilla personally. It was directed at the institution's failure to recognize the unchecked expansion of informal authority. Camilla's composure tightened, though she remained controlled. She asked whether the evidence suggested deliberate concealment. William replied that concealment was not the issue. The palace had adjusted to influence rather than examining it. Over time, that adjustment had become invisible. As the final section of the evidence was laid out, the room grew increasingly still. This portion traced how staff behavior had changed subtly in response to perceived authority. Requests were prioritized without instruction. Decisions were softened without explanation. Deference has replaced process. This was the point at which denial became untenable. Camilla did not collapse then. She did not protest or retreat. What changed was her posture. The assurance that influence was benign gave way to the recognition that it had consequences beyond intention. The room could feel the shift, even before it was named. William closed the folder with restraint. He did not summarize. He allowed the evidence to stand on its own, trusting that its structure spoke more clearly than argument. He then said something that altered the tone of the meeting entirely. He stated that the evidence had not been presented to assign blame, but to establish reality. What followed, he said, would not be punitive. It would be corrective. The palace could not continue operating under assumptions that no longer held. That statement reframed what the meeting represented. This was not exposure for exposure's sake. It was preparation. Camilla's betrayal in real time. The room did not erupt when the evidence fell silent. Instead, it was constricted. The air seemed to tighten as each person present absorbed the implications not as abstract institutional failure, but as a personal recalibration of trust. What Prince William had placed on the table was not accused in language, but in structure, and structure is far harder to argue with than motive. Queen Camilla remained composed at first, her posture upright, her hands still. That composure was not performative. It reflected a lifetime spent navigating scrutiny through control rather than reaction. Yet even control has limits, and those limits began to show as the room's attention narrowed toward the role she had played rather than the intent she believed had guided her. William did not rush to label what the evidence described. He allowed others to connect the implications themselves. The betrayal, as it emerged, was not a singular act of disloyalty. It was a gradual substitution of personal judgment for institutional boundaries, repeated often enough that it became invisible to those who benefited from its convenience. This distinction mattered deeply to Princess Anne, who watched the exchange with a precision honed by decades of institutional experience. She recognized that the most corrosive breaches are rarely loud. They are normalized. They persist because they feel helpful. That recognition shifted the tenor of the room from disbelief to reckoning. Camilla spoke again, her voice steady but edged now with urgency. She did not deny the interactions described. She did not dispute the outcomes traced. Instead, she framed her actions as protective, born of a belief that stability sometimes requires intervention beyond formal process. Her words carried sincerity, but they also revealed the very assumption the evidence challenged, that proximity confers authority by necessity. William responded carefully, choosing precision over emotion. He acknowledged the desire to protect, but he drew a line between protection and prerogative. The betrayal, he explained, lay not in intention, but in substitution. Institutional safeguards exist to prevent exactly this conflation, where personal conviction replaces collective accountability. As he spoke, the shift in Camilla's demeanor became perceptible. Her gaze moved from the documents to the faces around the table, searching not for allies, but for context. The room offered none. What she encountered instead was recognition, quiet and collective, that the pattern described could no longer be defended as benign. The unraveling did not occur through accusation, it occurred through acknowledgement. One by one, the assumptions that had sustained informal influence were named implicitly by their absence. There was no record because a record had not been required. There was no oversight because oversight had been assumed unnecessary. There was no challenge because challenges had been socially discouraged. This was the betrayal the palace could not ignore. Not a breach of loyalty, but a breach of boundary. Charles spoke briefly, his tone measured and heavy. He did not question Camilla's devotion to the institution. He questioned the cost of allowing devotion to operate without constraint. His words were not condemnatory, but they carried finality. The crown cannot function on private assurances when public responsibility is at stake. Camilla listened, her composure thinning. The realization that her actions, undertaken in what she believed was service, had undermined the very structure she sought to protect, began to register fully. This was not a misunderstanding to be clarified. It was a reality to be confronted. William then articulated what made the betrayal untenable. The evidence showed that informal influence had not merely supplemented the process, it had displaced it. Decisions that should have been deliberated collectively had been shaped privately. Outcomes that required transparency were guided by proximity. The institution's resilience had been compromised not by external attack, but by internal convenience. The room felt the weight of that assessment. This was not a moral failing that could be addressed through apology. It was an operational failure that required correction. The distinction stripped the moment of sentiment, leaving only consequence. Camilla's response, when it came, was quieter. She acknowledged that boundaries may have blurred, that her role had expanded without a formal definition. She expressed regret not for intent, but for effect. That admission, though measured, marked a turning point. It signaled that the reality William described could no longer be dismissed. Anne observed this exchange with a mix of resolve and restraint. She understood that the unraveling of such a pattern is rarely explosive. It is incremental, painful, and irreversible. Once influence is named as overreach, it cannot return to invisibility. William did not press further. He did not enumerate every instance or amplify the record. He understood that saturation would provoke defensiveness rather than clarity. The betrayal had been exposed sufficiently. What mattered now was not elaboration, but response. The room settled into a tense quiet, each person recalibrating their understanding of what had occurred. Camilla's authority, once diffuse and assumed, now appeared bound by a definition she had never sought but could no longer avoid. The betrayal was not that she had acted, it was that she had acted. It was that the institution had allowed action to substitute for governance. As the meeting paused, not adjourned but suspended, the significance of what had unraveled became clear. Trust, once eroded by normalization, does not return through explanation. It requires restructuring. The palace stood on the edge of that necessity. Camilla's composure held, but it was no longer anchored in certainty. It was anchored in recognition. The realization that what had been presented could not be undone, only addressed, settled heavily. William gathered the documents back into the folder, not as a gesture of closure, but as an indication that the most difficult part was still ahead, and what followed would test not only authority, but endurance. The collapse that silenced the room. The collapse did not come suddenly, nor did it arrive as a spectacle. It emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as the accumulated weight of the meeting finally exceeded what composure alone could sustain. Queen Camilla sat very still, her hands folded more tightly than before, her posture rigid with concentration. She had weathered criticism, scandal, and years of scrutiny with practiced restraint, but this moment was different. What unsettled the room was the shift in her breathing. It was subtle, noticeable only to those closest, but it signaled strain beneath the surface calm. Her gaze, once steady and appraising, began to falter, drifting briefly toward the table before returning to William with an intensity that suggested effort rather than confidence. Prince William recognized the change immediately as Camilla attempted to speak again, but the words did not come as smoothly as before. Her voice, when it emerged, carried less certainty, less command. She began to frame her actions once more as protective, as necessary under extraordinary circumstances. But the argument no longer held the room, not because it lacked sincerity, but because it no longer addressed the core issue. Protection without boundaries had become exposure. As she spoke, the strain became visible, and as King Charles watched in silence, his expression became grave and conflicted. The collapse unfolding before him was not merely physical or emotional. It was symbolic. It represented the moment when personal partnership yielded fully to institutional priority. His instinct was to move, to offer reassurance, but he remained still. Princess Anne noticed the moment Camilla's composure gave way. It was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Camilla's shoulders sagged slightly, her breath catching just enough to reveal that the weight she carried could no longer be masked. Anne understood immediately that the meeting had reached its emotional limit. Anything further risked turning reckoning into cruelty. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that felt heavier than before. No one spoke, no one moved. The collapse, such as it was, did not involve falling or outcry. It involved recognition. Recognition that authority once assumed had been stripped of its foundation. Recognition that intent could not reverse impact. Recognition that the institution had chosen structure over sentiment. Camilla lowered her gaze then, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. The effort to hold control had become unsustainable. Those present understood that what they were witnessing was not weakness, but consequence. William finally spoke, not to press further, but to steady the moment. His tone softened slightly, though his message did not. He stated that the meeting would pause, not conclude, to allow space for what had been revealed to be fully processed. The pause mattered. It prevented the collapse from becoming a spectacle. Camilla did not protest the pause. She did not argue for continuation. She accepted it with a small nod, a gesture that conveyed understanding more than agreement. Her breathing steadied slightly, though the tension did not disappear. The room sensed that something essential had been lost, not only for her, but for the institution as a whole. Anne rose slowly, signaling that the meeting would indeed adjourn temporarily. Her movement broke the paralysis without trivializing the moment. She stated simply that what had been placed on the table required reflection before response. No one challenged her, as the reflection was now unavoidable. As chairs shifted and papers were gathered, the room remained subdued. There were no side conversations, no whispered exchanges. Each person carried away a different understanding of what had occurred, but all shared the awareness that the collapse they had witnessed could not be undone. Camilla stood last, and for a moment, it appeared she might speak again, perhaps to reclaim ground or reframe intention. Instead, she chose silence. That choice, deliberate and restrained, marked the final stage of the collapse. The doors opened quietly, and the participants exited without ceremony. Outside, the palace continued its routine, unaware of the recalibration taking place within its core. The collapse had not been public. It had not been loud. But it had silenced the room in a way that would echo long after the doors closed. What had occurred was not the end of the reckoning. It was the point at which the reckoning became unavoidable. Shockwaves through the palace and the royal family. The effects of the meeting did not announce themselves. They radiated outward quietly, altering behavior before language could catch up. Within hours, the palace began to feel different, not because orders had been issued, but because assumptions had dissolved. Prince William did not circulate the details of what had occurred. He did not offer summaries or clarifications. His silence functioned as a boundary, signaling that the matter had moved beyond conversation and into consequence. This response unsettled those accustomed to relational navigation. For years, the palace had relied on familiarity to smooth friction. Now, familiarity offered no advantage. King Charles felt the shock most acutely in private. Publicly, continuity was maintained with practiced ease. Privately, the collision between personal loyalty and institutional necessity became unavoidable. The meeting had exposed a fracture he could neither deny nor repair through comfort alone. The king chose restraint. He did not convene family councils or issue private directives. He allowed the adjustments already underway to proceed without interference. Queen Camilla experienced the shock as narrowing rather than confrontation. The day after the meeting, her schedule remained intact, yet its substance changed. Engagements were confirmed later. Briefings arrived thinner. Conversations that once extended beyond the agenda are now concluded promptly. No one treated her with disrespect. That made the change more profound. The isolation was subtle, almost courteous. It was not exile, it was decoupling. The palace did not withdraw recognition, it withdrew its reliance. That distinction left little to contest and nothing to appeal. Authority that depends on being needed diminishes when need is redistributed. Family reactions unfolded unevenly as some members expressed concern in private, not about the necessity of correction, but about its cost. Others remained silent, interpreting silence as the safest posture in a moment defined by scrutiny. No one publicly defended the status quo. Defense would have implied alignment with a pattern now deemed untenable. Princess Anne approached the aftermath with much clarity. She spoke individually with those most affected by the shift, emphasizing continuity of duty and dignity of conduct. Anne's presence steadied the palace in a way no directive could. She neither minimized the fallout nor dramatized it. She treated it as an institutional correction, long deferred. Her calm did not soften the impact, but it prevented panic from filling the void left by explanation. Within the household, alliances recalibrated quietly. Staff who had relied on informal mediation sought formal authorization. Those whose roles had expanded through proximity found those expansions reversed without comment. The palace did not accuse, it corrected. The absence of a public statement intensified internal unease. Without external framing, everyone inside understood that the matter was still unfolding. Silence did not indicate closure, it indicated preparation. The knowledge that further action might follow kept the atmosphere taut. Camilla's response to this phase was marked by restraint. She did not seek to rally support or contest perception. She reduced her visibility slightly, not as retreat, but as recalibration. Those close to her noted a shift from confidence to calculation. The collapse in the meeting had not broken her composure, but it had altered her approach. The family dynamic absorbed this change unevenly. Personal relationships remained, but they were reshaped by awareness. Conversations became careful, topics avoided. What had once been navigated through trust now required sensitivity. The cost of exposure was not only institutional, it was relational. William observed these shockwaves without intervening. He understood that intervention would repoliticize a process designed to depersonalize correction. The palace needed to adapt organically to new boundaries. His role was to hold the line, not manage emotion. That restraint carried its own cost. Some interpreted his silence as distance, others saw it as resolved. Both interpretations circulated, neither confirmed nor denied. Ambiguity, once again, served a function. As days passed, the shock settled into a new rhythm. The palace did not fracture. It tightened. The absence of overt conflict became its own signal. Whatever had been exposed was being absorbed without resistance. That absorption suggested acceptance, even if it was reluctant. What remained unresolved was direction. The meeting had exposed a boundary breach, and the collapse had forced acknowledgement. But the consequence had not yet been named. The palace existed in a liminal space between recognition and action. That uncertainty weighed heavily on the family. Without resolution, imagination filled the gaps. Speculation remained internal, but it nonetheless shaped behavior. Everyone understood that the next step would define not only Camilla's role, but the monarchy's tolerance for informal power. As the shockwaves continued to ripple, one truth became clear. The palace had crossed a threshold. It had demonstrated a willingness to confront internal distortion without spectacle. That willingness would demand consistency. Whether the institution could sustain that consistency remained an open question. The reckoning. The monarchy cannot escape. The reckoning did not arrive as a single decision or declaration. It emerged gradually, through accumulation, as the palace adjusted to a reality it could no longer deny. For the monarchy, the most profound consequence was not reputational, it was structural. Informal power, once tolerated as a lubricant of tradition, had revealed itself as a liability when left unchecked. The exposure forced a recalibration that could not be reversed without inviting the same vulnerability again. In choosing correction over comfort, the institution accepted a future that would be more constrained, but also more defensible. Prince William understood this more clearly than anyone. His role had shifted not because of ambition, but because necessity demanded it. By placing evidence above sentiment and process above proximity, he had demonstrated a model of authority that did not wait for accession to assert itself. That demonstration would not be forgotten, inside the palace or beyond it. William did not speak publicly about what had occurred, and that silence was deliberate. He allowed the consequences to speak through behavior rather than proclamation. Systems tightened, records multiplied, access narrowed. None of this required explanation. It required consistency. Authority, once exercised quietly and coherently, reshapes expectation without fanfare. King Charles faced a parallel reckoning. His reign had been defined by transition, patience, and an instinct to preserve equilibrium. The events that unfolded forced him to accept that equilibrium sometimes masks imbalance. By choosing not to intervene against the recalibration already underway, he signaled acceptance of a harder truth. Preservation without accountability erodes legitimacy. Charles's silence carried weight. It told the palace that the correction would stand. It told the family that personal discomfort could not outweigh institutional integrity. And it told the public, indirectly, that the monarchy was prepared to confront itself rather than outsource blame. Queen Camilla remained central to the reckoning, even as her visibility diminished. The collapse in the meeting had not ended her role, but it had transformed it irrevocably. The influence that once flowed through familiarity now encounters boundaries at every turn. Camilla's response to this redefinition was measured. She did not contest the process or seek to reclaim what had been lost through persuasion. She adapted, understanding that resistance would only confirm the necessity of correction. The monarchy, in turn, adjusted around this new reality. The absence of dramatic fallout became its own signal. Institutions reveal their strength not by avoiding crisis, but by absorbing it without fracture. The palace did not fracture. It hardened. Princess Anne articulated this privately in her own way. She observed that reckoning is only meaningful when followed by discipline. The palace, she noted, had finally chosen discipline over denial. That choice would demand vigilance long after the immediate tension faded. For staff and senior figures alike, the lesson was clear. Informal influence would no longer substitute for governance. Emotional proximity would not override procedural clarity. The palace would function more slowly, perhaps, but it would function with fewer blind spots. This shift carries cost. It strains relationships. It removes comfort. It replaces intuition with a record. Yet it also restores a principle on which the monarchy depends for survival. That authority must be accountable to structure, not shielded by tradition alone. As weeks passed, the reckoning took on a quieter form. Meetings resumed under new norms. Briefings adhered to stricter frameworks. Decisions left clearer trails. The palace did not announce reform, but reform had occurred. For William, the path ahead was now unmistakable. Leadership would not wait for the ceremony. It would be exercised where risk emerged. That understanding would shape every future crisis, every internal challenge, every moment when sentiment tempted delay. The monarchy cannot escape the reckoning because it has already internalized it. Once an institution acknowledges its own vulnerability, it cannot return to innocence. It can only move forward with intention. What began as exposure ended as transformation, not dramatic, not theatrical, but decisive. The collapse that silenced the room did not weaken the crown. It clarified it. And clarity, once achieved at such cost, becomes the most valuable form of stability the monarchy possesses. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.